Hopefully you can see that. If somebody could give me a thumbs up so I can, great, all right. So the technology works. Before we jump in, caveat, my wife reminded me that this is a time of day when our internet somehow decides to be a little slow. So if anything doesn't seem to um, be easy to hear on my end, just send a chat or try and let me know that way. But I'll do my best. So here in part two, um, Courtney did a wonderful job in part one, providing some ideas for some classroom supports, some various ways to provide classroom management supports across a range of students, particularly in the remote setting. And so we're going to continue that with some other strategies and things to think about today. Before I jump in, the first thing I think I want to do besides say welcome is thank you. I think your work this year, and I think even particularly after the new year, our pace didn't slow down at all, has been tremendous. As a parent and a special educator, I know what you're doing, and I know how important your efforts are and how hard you're working. So, and the idea that you're joining us at 4 o'clock after your school day is amazing to think about. So your efforts are definitely appreciated. So I'm going to start us off, and one of the things that we talked about that we thought might be helpful to think about on top of some good behavior management strategies in the remote setting is to think about data. Obviously, there's a lot of needs that data serve, whether it's in the IEP process, providing student supports, thinking about the students that might need support, who doesn't. Data should drive a lot of our decisions, and we can't really do good classroom PBIS or school-wide PBIS without good data. So we're going to talk a little bit about some practical, easy-to-use approaches, and then after me, Courtney will jump in and talking about a problem-solving model. We're a little bit of a larger group. We're not huge, but a little bit larger. I would say if you drop questions in the chat, when I get to the end, we'll take a look, and if there's any that need to be answered immediately, I can certainly do that. I'll also drop my slides in the chat once I'm finished. So when we're talking about data, obviously data is nothing new to special education. Certainly pre-pandemic, we had a lot of paperwork and a lot of forms to fill out and things of that nature. So that problem is not necessarily new, although I think for many of you, for many of us, things have been exacerbated, right? So many people with the IEP process being shifted around, remote learning plans, et cetera. The idea of documenting what you're doing has become even more important as things shift quickly. The other thing that we know is that our goals that we have for students, whether it's IEP goals, general instructional goals, they need to be appropriately ambitious. So there's a legal side to that, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on today. There's a legal reason why that's the case from the Supreme Court. But we also know that's just the right thing to do. We want students to be in an environment where they are going to make steady and meaningful progress throughout their school year. So the goals that we set for students need to be tied to really good data. But you also have some current realities as it relates to remote learning, hybrid learning, high flex, whatever the case may be. You have multiple modalities, sometimes shifting throughout the day, throughout the week, sometimes shifting with little to no notice. You go back and forth between online and in-person instruction. Many of you are dealing with a lot of IEP meetings. Certainly at the beginning of the year, I know many people were, and I'm sure that volume hasn't necessarily decreased a significant amount even in recent months. So your current realities don't say, well, this is a lot, you shouldn't collect any more data. It says this is a lot, we need to figure out a way to collect data that's going to be meaningful and relevant to you, particularly related to students in remote settings. Many of which may be experiencing significant social, emotional, behavioral challenges. You'll recall back in March and April of last year, one of the things that was said almost immediately was, what about the mental health needs of students? And that's certainly something that people are still very concerned about as we slowly, hopefully, get back to a more normal pace of things. So I'm going to actually skip this slide and come back to it in a little bit if time allows. But So given that we have this need, we know that data should drive the decisions we make, whether it's behavior plans, interventions, how we adjust our classroom management system. The need that we have is that I need something flexible that's easy to use, um, to collect data across settings, modalities, people. I know as somebody that does behavioral consultation, does functional behavioral assessments for students with disabilities, um, if I'm asking a teacher to collect data while they're teaching, I know sometimes that can be a challenging task at best and sometimes almost impossible depending what I'm asking them to do. So we need a flexible, easy to use system. And that's what I want to spend a few minutes talking about this afternoon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this system called direct behavior ratings. It's an easy to use data collection system. It's flexible, it's evidence-based. So it meets a lot of the criteria that we have now. DBR for short is not new, but I think it plays a unique role potentially in what we're trying to do with not only online and remote learning, but learning that's taking place in multiple modalities across classrooms, across both the remote and face-to-face environments. So that's what I'll spend a few minutes talking about. So DBR, direct behavior ratings, if you're an ed tech or a special education teacher, I know that perhaps 100% of you have had to collect some sort of behavioral data on students, whether it's anecdotal data, taking notes, filling out rating scales, um, direct observation data, frequency counts of how many times a kid might be hitting themselves or somebody else. Many of you, if not all of you, have done that. So DBR takes the best of both worlds, the systematic direct observation data, which is an evaluator sitting down and just watching the kid and not doing anything else. That's systematic direct observation. Folks like Courtney are systematically trained to do that as a behavior analyst. And we call that the gold standard of behavioral assessment because it really tells us exactly what's going on in the environment for the learner. There's also behavior rating scales that are norm referenced. You see them a lot in evaluation processes for identifying students for special education. But those don't give you the day-to-day, moment-to-moment data. They help you with for diagnostic purposes, the IEP process, evaluation. They both serve a purpose, but they have their challenges. Direct observation, where I just sit for a half hour and just watch a kid, most of you don't have that time. And then the behavior rating scales, again, they don't really help you with moment-to-moment data collection. So direct behavior ratings takes both of those pieces and melds them together into a system that's easy to use, flexible, and can be used continuously and help you make decisions. So the system of DBR has 3 different behaviors, and I'm not going to read the whole slide to you, and I'll share resources after the fact so you'll have this with you. But there's 3 primary behaviors that have been researched in the DBR literature. And you'll see the utility and usefulness of these as we go through them. One of them is academically engaged. So to what extent is the student both physically and mentally engaging with instruction? Those could be anything from the academic behaviors like answering questions and writing, or sometimes visually engaging with the teacher or with their materials. So that's one behavior. Another one is respectful behavior. What's interesting about this one is, when they first rolled out DBR, they said, well, this one's not gonna, everyone has such different perspectives on what respect means, and it can vary across settings and cultures, and that's certainly true. But they found over time that using DBR for respectful behavior is reliable and valid. So you can see the different examples for what respect might look like. And then disruptive behavior. So to what extent is the student engaging in behaviors that disrupt their learning or the learning of others? One of the important things to know about DBR is that you can be rating these 3 behaviors, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do one without the other. You could certainly be respectful while also being disruptive. You could be academically engaged, but also disrespectful, so that there can be overlap in terms of what the student is doing. So those are the primary behaviors that DBR takes a look at. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, are there behaviors that don't fit? There certainly might be. For general behaviors across settings and environments, this captures many of the day-to-day needs that you might see if I have to collect data on a student to determine their social and behavioral progress in school. So any number of behaviors could certainly fit within these broader definitions. They might not be perfect for you. It might not be the only piece of data you want to collect, but again, it's a really flexible approach to looking at these broad behaviors. All right, so let's take a look at DBR. So the first thing you do is you have to determine, what am I going to be observing? Am I going to look at all three of those behaviors, just one? You need to figure that out based on the student's needs. The second thing is you decide when you're actually going to collect this data and who's going to do it. The nice thing about this system is it's very flexible. You can collect data for 30 minutes. You collect data for a half hour to an hour. You collect data for half a day. The ratings still, the research shows the ratings are still valid and reliable, which is a really good thing. So you could look for part of the day, the whole day, a little small chunk of time, um, or vary that throughout depending on the student's needs and what data you're trying to gather. It also is flexible where you can write notes, that sort of thing. It's not just looking at ratings, it's actually looking at the student holistically if you want to. And then given that the basic data, you can then plot it graphically. You can create graphs and summarize the data pretty quickly. And I've even found with direct behavior ratings, even before you graph data or try to analyze it, you can quickly see on a data collection sheet where the student's at, even if you're looking at 4 or 5 at the same time. So this is what a DBR looks like. This is the academically engaged behavior. And what you do is, let's say you're going to observe for, you have a 45-minute instructional period over Zoom, or maybe you're doing some direct instruction with a couple of kids. At the end of that period, you think, well, how often or how long was the student academically engaged? You make your best estimate. So this is the caveat with DBR. You have to have enough interaction and observation of the student to make a good rating. So if you're in a small group delivering instruction, but the kid you're trying to observe is behind you, that's probably not going to work. But what will work is if I'm in a group of 5 or 6 kids and Johnny is one of those 5 or 6 kids, I don't have to sit and watch him for those 30 minutes. As long as I have a really good sense of how his period went, I can make a pretty good rating. So at the end of the period, you just cross off whether you think it's 50% of the time, 90%, 10%, and then you move on to what you're doing next. It only takes you a few seconds to score it, and then you're on to something else. You didn't have to spend all that time, the 30 minutes, watching the kid, but this data can be useful within a few days of collecting it to be able to understand where the student's at across environments. You can also collect data on all three behaviors if that were relevant for that particular student. Maybe you're just looking at the extent to which they're disruptive and disrupting their learning or others, or maybe you really think that they have a number of needs and you want to look across those behaviors. Either one will work. So these are some examples that I just made up and filled out on my own with a fictitious student. So the nice thing about this is you can take your direct behavior ratings, your DBRs, and then you can also write notes. We know certainly the numbers only tell part of the story. We want to know what happened. What did this look like? And maybe you have a kid that was engaged for 30% of the time, but 50% of the time they weren't there because they logged off of Zoom. So you can capture that in the notes section. Maybe the student's working on coping skills, so you can say, well, they did use some of their deep breathing exercises that they've been taught by the school social worker. So you can make a note of that to say, well, they're using some of the skills that we've identified on their IEP goals. So you can take notes, you can have those quick ratings at the end of that period. There's also an option in DBR, which I think is nice, and it's we know that academically engaged, respectful, and disruptive are the most heavily research-based behaviors for DBR, but they do allow you to think about the idea, well, there could be other behaviors that I want to monitor or behaviors that I want to focus more specifically on. Maybe it's just one type of disruptive behavior that's important to me, and you can do that in DBR. All you would want to do is be really careful to have a very specific description, especially if you're not the person doing the observation. Maybe you're an ed tech and you also have a special educator you're working with and you're completing data collection at different times of the day on a kid, or a general education teacher who's been asked to collect the data, making sure that description is clear is really important. So if you develop your own behaviors, they should be objective and measurable, and you special educators know all about that. You should have examples, especially if somebody else is going to be completing the form. So not just like a dictionary definition of the behavior, but what could that look like? So some exemplars can be really helpful. Um, and then I think it's also important to be confident that most of the needs that students might have can be assessed with the standard behaviors. So don't feel obligated to create your own unless you're really trying to target something specific. Engagement, disruptive, and respectful can generally cover a lot of things. So quickly as I wrap up, so those are some examples of what you might collect data on more specifically. Maybe you're not just looking at engagement or disruptive. You want to focus on, well, how often are they out of their seat, or how often are they, making physical contact with others that they shouldn't be? How often are they taking breaks, whatever the case might be? Some things that wouldn't be so good are just saying, well, they're out of the area that they're supposed to be. That's probably not specific enough. Um, Hitting may or may not be specific enough. Um, how often they're calm, that's a pretty subjective term. So again, you'd want to be more specific, and then think about being a little more specific with some of these, what I call better examples than the non-examples. So it's a flexible system in that respect as well, that it's not just pretty easy to use and can be used for short periods of time, long periods of time, but you can use your own behaviors if you wanted to. If you ever want to use this for intervention or for explaining and sharing data with students, there is the smiley face continuum that they've identified. In the middle range is so-so, 0 to 2, not so good, 8 to 10 is much better. I've certainly had experience where kids see this frowny face and they get really upset. So you want to know your student well and identify if that's okay to use with them as they learn to understand and self-evaluate their own behavior. Beyond gathering data, DBR has a lot of different uses. It's such a wonderful system. It's great for parent communication. Most parents can quickly see the 0 to 10 scale and know how the kid's day went across those behaviors. It can be part of a behavior support plan. Maybe you're rating the student on those behaviors and they're earning reinforcement based on the different ratings and scores they get. Students can then self-monitor as they get more independent, and maybe you're fading them off their behavior plans. DBR has been used that way. One thing I didn't also put on here was the idea that you can screen students using DBR. If you want more information on that, contact me. It's a little more complex. There's some specific steps, but if you want to do some universal screening with DBR, it's probably not my preferred method, but the research says you can do it. And then, of course, there's some less useful ways to use DBR. If it's a very, very low rate behavior or something that occurs once a day, like skipping school, I'm not going to use DBR for that. Internalizing needs that don't show themselves through respect, engagement, or being disruptive. Certainly, many times kids with depression or anxiety could be disengaged or disruptive, but if those aren't the behaviors you're targeting, DBR probably won't be so helpful. And then other things that you're more focused on outcomes. Well, I'm not as concerned about how engaged they are. I'm concerned about how much work they completed. That probably wouldn't be a DBR scenario. Again, I'll put these slides in the chat, which has these links. There's a DBR site from the University of Connecticut that I love, has tons of good information. And then the other two sites are the Intensive Intervention, National Center on Intensive Intervention, which looks at both academic and behavioral interventions. They have some good resources around using it for goal development to intensify interventions, and they make a lot of direct connections to DBR. So those are a couple of resources that I'll share with you, and I'll drop the slides in the chat. See, one question, could you use these scales on a daily basis, or is this used more periodically? It's flexible, right? So if you used it every single day, that's great. If you did it once a week or a couple times a week, all you want to do is just account for that and make note of it. Say, we collected this data on Tuesdays and Thursdays during the remote session, or we did it just on Wednesdays and Fridays when we were in school. Um, I would just document that and know when you're collecting the data. And the forms have the more broader, more complete forms that I'll share with you, have that places to put that information so it's documented. Good question. All right, so I will turn it over to Courtney.
All right, thank you, Brian. That was great. I've used DVRs multiple times in the past, and I wanted to say you probably could use this class-wide as well, especially if you are setting a group goal. And you don't have to use it every day around the clock. You could just things are ticking up. You know, the temperature in the room is getting up there prior to a vacation or prior to something exciting where the kids are uh, just being a little more excitable. And so you could bring it out temporarily as a novel type of acknowledgement, even to say, let's see if we can score an 8 or a 9 today. So I've used it in that modality too. I am going to share my screen here. Let's get to that. Okay. You guys see my screen okay? Just give me a thumbs up. Awesome. And now, oh, okay. All right. So I wanted to start out here because I feel like this is going to couch the rest of the content for today. If children aren't learning, we're not teaching, right? And so we need to think about how much of this can we exact change around by focusing in on those evidence-based practices that we hear about so frequently. And so I want to talk to you about those practices in terms of probability. And that is, we are doing things with kids all day, every day. And what we want to do is sort of stack the deck with the practices and the strategies that increase probability for success. So I do believe that practices matter and that we have to have a way to identify what are those practices, to build our practice and routine and good habits around teaching centered on those practices, and then be reflective in terms of what's working, what might I need to tweak or change or adapt or modify, and then what are some things maybe I need to let go of or to think a little bit more critically around. So all behavior change is an instructional process, and that means instruction matters. It matters in terms of reading instruction. It matters for math instruction. We know it matters for social skills instruction. And I believe that instruction matters too when it comes to behavior, right? I think we can instruct on our behavioral expectations and then provide feedback around that. And ultimately, we know that if nothing changes, nothing changes. And so we want to change some of our own adult behaviors, knowing that can turn the dial for student behavior. So teachers matter, you matter. And I want to echo Brian and his gratitude for having you here with us on Inauguration Day at 4 o'clock. And really appreciate that you're here. When we think about what is an effective teacher, we know that anyone can tell students what to do, and I think about that in my own home. You know, that my kids are my greatest teachers, and I think about the difference between I just tell them what to do versus I create this environment that's more likely for them to do what I need them to do, right? Because I can tell you from experience here in my home and in schools and classrooms that just telling them what to do, it's not enough. And now when we're learning remotely, we've really stripped a lot of students of the things that motivate them to attend, to engage, to cooperate. They're not interacting as much or as meaningfully with their peers. They're not there for their snack meal time, their conversations in the hallway, the interactions with people who care about them on a in a personal way. And so we're asking them to maintain all of the things that they were doing in school, with a lot of the reinforcement and acknowledgement and rich interaction that they were experiencing while they're in person, but to maintain those behaviors now when they're sitting in front of a computer day after day after day. So, anyway, I think that we have to rethink a little bit in terms of how we are creating um, those environments. And I want to think about it in terms of these three elements. One's instruction. We're going to talk. We talked in part one about explicit and direct teaching of our expectations. We're going to review a little bit of that again today, using authentic and I would say meaningful examples that relate to the student and what they could be experiencing, multiple opportunities for students to engage, and then what are the ways to engage students that are meaningful for that developmental level, right? It's going to look really different for kindergarten than it is for, an 11th grade student or a junior. Also about the environment. Now, arranges physical space. You might think, okay, if I'm teaching remotely, what does that mean and look like? Well, it could look like small group, right? Given a task with a checklist and time to meet and interact, you may have much more engagement than if you were to do just lecture style instruction. Developing routines about how to engage with your online technology and different platforms. And then being consistent so that students, when they tune in, when they turn it on, when they log in, can have some sense of a reliable, predictable flow of activities that help them feel competent around navigating their time with you. And then the last one really isn't the last one. It might even be the most important, especially as students are feeling a bit of social isolation, even as we're feeling somewhat socially isolated from our students, is this idea of relationship. So how are we communicating? And what are we communicating about? We want to make sure that it includes that personal care and regard for who they are, what they're up to, how they're feeling, aside from the pure, strict academic content. And we want that to be conveyed through genuine interactions. And if you are an instructor or a teacher right now of a large group, this may be difficult. And so, how are you going to circle back to those one-to-one conversations that might mimic how you're going to bump into a student in the hallway, or a conversation you might have with them while you're waiting for something and standing in line, right? Those matter in terms of our relationship building opportunities. So, how can we think creatively about how to maintain some of that and keep that? Keep some of those opportunities in place. When I say the word probability, for me, I get flashbacks to statistics with the bell curve, right? And we know that our students are somewhere here on this graph, that they are spread out. Some of our students are going to do well despite us, right? They've got the characteristics, the home supports, they've got the cognitive goods that and the social skills to navigate just about any kind of obstacle that's going to come their way. And we guide and we push, but putting up a few bumper rails, we know that they're going to make their way. Then we've got a group that is the instruction is pretty critical. We need to be there. They need our feedback, but we also know that feedback provided, good instruction given, they're going to make it up over that hump and slide right down into the and cruise to the other side where all those valuable outcomes and good things are awaiting them, right? Social success, academic success, more opportunities. And then we have these students that fall in terms of risk level in this shaded area. And here they're going to need really good instruction. They're going to need really good feedback from us. And they're also going to need a little something more. It's going to need to be individualized based on their needs. It's going to probably require an intensity the other students don't need. And they might need some significant pushing and guiding up that mountain so that they can see what the view looks like on the other side and feel the motivation and and the dreams that are available to them if they can stay the course. And so when I think about the time I spend providing interventions, assessments, supports, training, etc., it tends to be for that group in the risk factor where everything seems uphill, right? And for me, these are the students where we can't miss the boat. We really have to be thinking prevention oriented. If they're on track, don't get comfortable, right? How do we keep them on track? What are the foundational components with family communication and supports that will support them in those sort of tough barriers that might get in their way as they continue to climb uphill? So I think about the practices that we invest in moving forward, and I want those practices and the valuable time we have with students to be aligned to what works best. In terms of what works, we know a lot, right? Based on decades now of really good empirical research, valid, reliable, repeated, we have a good understanding of what works. And what we want to do is focus on those practices that have been identified in that blue zone. And if you're not familiar with this, sort of half circle here, this is taken from Visible Learning and by a researcher named Hattie, who did a pretty significant meta-analysis. And he identified practices and intervention supports, things that we do in school with kids that have a zone of desired effect. And that's, we kind of want to look there in terms of guidance for what are we doing, what are we missing, and maybe some things that we could maybe give up on and replace with things that are found to work. One of those things that I would say when we're teaching remotely is don't underestimate the value of a schedule, and a schedule that sticks. And I know that's so hard because we're in person, we're remote, we're hybrid, we're remote again, right? What does that mean? But having a contingency plan. I did work with a school where they had a team, they were in person, but they had a team completely devoted to planning this remote day just for practice, right? We're going to practice with the logins, the passwords, the platforms. We're going to have them submit their assignments in this portal just like they would at home, and create the fluency around that remote technology they're going to be required to use should we go remote again. Now, for some of your schools, that might already be a practice that's used widely and you're comfortable with that. For some other schools, this could be a really good use of your time, both in teaching students and in communicating and providing training for families. And I will tell you too that having 4 remote learners, I can get buried in passwords for portals and online reading and science and different things that they're supposed to be doing that I'm supposed to be tracking. It gets a little overwhelming. So be thinking about how you create your schedule, how you communicate your schedule, and then the feedback that you get or you provide for kids when they do really good with attendance and logging in, and how you are error correcting if they should miss. What are your practices to help support consistency for those getting to class on time, being consistent, and explaining changes as they should arrive? Once students do log in and they make it to remote instruction, consider advanced organizers. I teach remotely at the college level, and we are given a lot of support and guidance and exemplars for how to stack our online learning modules so that they're consistent, that students can log in and clearly understand where's the content, what's due, when is it due, and they can see how they can navigate and access the things that they need to access. So I like the idea of creating these advanced organizers. I have dabbled with multiple ways to provide advanced organizers, but I'm a big fan of everything in one place. That said, I've been having some fun with creating these choice boards. And that's kind of where I've got a slide up with everything that they need for the day. And especially in a class, I might have, multiple post-it notes with different things that they need to complete during that online activity or for their remote learning experience for that day. Now, this is just a quick one where I've just put in to place some class resources. These are all around classroom management. I've got a short video here. I like to have a little fun with like different pictures and discussion questions or things that I want them to be reflecting on, so that when I call on students, they kind of have an idea or an answer primed and ready to share. Another example of that is providing ways to connect um, with what's meaningful in their day, right? They're home, they're watching a lot of TV, right? They're on their social media. So I try to kind of make connections with what I think, what I hear about, and integrate that into teaching. So I might have something like a quick news flash, just a chance to connect and chat about something in the news or something important to them. So I couldn't not put this in here today. We've got our first woman vice president, and it just gives everyone a chance to maybe chat about what they would be chatting about if we were in person, right? So still providing the platform for that check-in. And if you were busy teaching, which I assume you were, and you missed the inauguration today, there was a poet by Amanda Gorman. I hope that you all take a moment to listen to. It was pretty powerful and important. So I put a link, by the way, these are live links, so you click on them and you can access all of those things. And this PowerPoint will be shared with you. Now, a little bit of review from part one. I want you to remember the importance of direct and explicit teaching when presenting instruction. So we don't want to assume our students know. We call this type of telling kids what not to do as more ineffective instruction, because it sets the occasion for student failure. We're asking them to think about behaviors we don't want them to do. And instead, we want to pose what we do want them to do. We want to prime them, show them, tell them, give them examples, model for them, and then have them give it a go of what do we want to see you doing? This is what's valued here. And these are the things that we've agreed on. So we want to tell them what to do. Now, in terms of trying to make this relevant, if you're not a big fan of my new favorite show, Schitt's Creek, I don't know if I can say that on webinar, but it's the name of a place. So one of my all-time favorite scenes from the show is between David and Moira. So Moira is David's mom. She's not much of a cook in the kitchen, and they decide to make a family meal. And they come across this direction in this old family recipe that says, fold in the cheese. And so David's saying, okay, like, Mom, all right, what does that mean? And she says, well, just fold it in. Right? And I think about that, right? There's a lot of things we want students to be doing and completing and turning in. And so if they go, yeah, but how do I do that? And we just say, well, just, for me, I hear myself say, well, just read the syllabus. Just read the syllabus. Just read the directions. And so it goes a little beyond that. We really want to tell them what we want them to do and why, but we want to show them what it looks like and then guide their practice, model it again, and then give them a chance to try it. So don't underrate the importance of showing them. And I can use, a recent example where I am working with a young woman who is engaged. Effort is super high, um, and cognitively she is low average. And when she hears directions, she gets the first thing that you say, and she gets the trail end of what you say, but she misses a lot of the meat in the middle. And for her, right, telling her is not adequate. You kind of need to demonstrate it once and do that comprehension check, read back to me the steps that I need you to do. She will soar if you take that approach with her and add in a checklist. Like, these are the components of the task that I'm asking you to do, so that she can check them off. Effort is high, motivation is high. She just gets lost in the language element. So having that guided practice paired with that graphic organizer really occasion sets up the occasion for her to be successful. So a little bit more on modeling and prompting. Modeling, we want to show them and describe why, create that rationale for them doing what we want them to do. And when I do this, sometimes I'm thinking aloud, especially if I make an error. I want to model them my own self-talk around making an error. Like, okay, I messed up here. This is where I kind of went wrong. So let me walk you through what I did and how I fixed it. I think that that's a really good um, time to demonstrate that we're not asking our students not to make mistakes. In fact, we want to show them mistakes are okay and are natural learning part of the process. And so how do we get back on track? Verbal prompts are also really helpful. They're just clear statements that act as reminders. And then pre-correction. Pre-correction is one, I think, of the most underutilized practices that will get us to that blue zone of desired effects. A pre-correction is simply we're correcting the behavior that we are anticipating to happen. If you're getting ready for instruction and someone is going to blurt out, we want to correct it before it happens. So we want to say something like, if you want to share, um, and I'm talking, how can you let me know that you are ready to share, right? Don't forget to raise your hand. So let's show me what that looks like, or you can raise a hand and Zoom, or indicate somehow in the chat or something, but you want to be clear about how you'd like students to do that and correct that problem before it occurs. And then thinking about engagement in two different ways. One is to actually engage them in instruction. And we can do that through opportunities to respond. So with opportunities to respond, there's been some research on this, and there is a ratio that we're striving for to keep students at their premium level of engagement. And when we think about when we're teaching, how we can get students involved or responding, we can do that in a number of ways. We can put a request out for a group response, right? So I could say to you all right now, give me a thumbs up if you understand different strategies um, to provide opportunities to respond for your students. And you could all of you could put your thumb up if you've got some strategies, or you could put your thumb down saying, yeah, I don't quite grasp that yet. That's an opportunity to respond, and that would be out to the group. So that would be considered a group response. You can ask closed or open questions. So a yes, no. If we're in person, you could say, move to this side of the room for this answer, move to that side of the room for that answer. That works too. And to the degree that you're doing that to a group, it would be a group response. If you're asking the student specifically, it would be an individual response. So you can do raise your hand. You can do a thumb dial, thumbs up, thumbs down if you're kind of so-so in the middle. You can have them create a response and share. And the create is liberally defined. You can think about writing on a note and sharing out with the group. It could be on a whiteboard and then sharing out with the class. Students can demonstrate their learning. They can turn and talk. I'm sure if we brainstorm some, we could create more examples. Sometimes in lecture halls, you'll see a clicker response. They could do a poll. Any of those would be considered opportunities to respond. And there's been quite a bit of research around opportunities to respond. And we're looking for about 3 per minute. 3 opportunities per minute to keep kids with us. Um, and the more opportunities to respond we provide, the less disruptive behavior we see. And that is a phenomena that I definitely have observed as someone who spends a lot of time in classrooms observing students, that the more instruction that is going on, the higher degree of engagement, the less behaviors we see. Um, Something to think about. And then also recruiting active attention. The more we embed things that are relevant to them, I'm spending a lot of time in high school these days, so I like to use some more kind of sophisticated humor here. We've got Moira Rose, right? If I want to give feedback to the students on the fly, I might flash a quick picture or something to bring them back to me, right? That might be a way to connect them. So both in my praise and in my redirection. And I'm just adding this little semicircle here again. We know that feedback has a very large effect size. So it's lives somewhere in this area. So the more feedback that we give, the better. These are just some strategies that are a bit of a review, but still really important. So big idea is to notice. So thank you for noticing this new notice. Your noticing has been noted, right? We want to provide that often and frequently and repeatedly. Other things, one of them, Brian had mentioned with the daily behavior rating, is to continuously be assessing academically, assessing behaviorally, and then goal setting. So not assessment for formal evaluation or reporting purposes, but really for behavior change. So frequent formative assessment, you could do summative assessment, but specific feedback around a criteria that has been established can be really important. And feedback based on attendance is criteria, right? What are our expectations for attendance and how are our students doing in relationship to that criteria? And then what practices could we be utilizing and implementing to move the bar there? We do want to acknowledge errors with correction. So we know students are going to continue to make errors. And so we want to think about feedback that's going to help change what's happening. And we can do that through questioning, right? So is that the right way? Is there a better way? And are you being respectful and tell me where we're going wrong here? You can also stop and do some reteaching. So that takes a little bit more time, but we could do this individually or a whole group and say, okay, what's a better way for us to move ahead? How could we have done that better? And what would it look like if it were more respectful? So take some time to brainstorm, then to model, then to set the occasion for them to correct their behaviors and move on. And then to facilitate success with positive feedback. So show me how to do that correctly. They demonstrate, and then you can say that's right. And let's remember to do that moving forward. Now, some behaviors, as Brian got us started out, are persistent and might be an area of more specific focus. So like last time, this time I wanted to provide you with another resource that lends itself to a read this today, use it tomorrow. Brian also mentioned the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and so I pulled this practice brief. It was just put out in September 2020. It's fairly new. It's resource rich, and the nice thing is it's short. So You're not going to get buried in this one. This is linked. So when you get the PowerPoint, just by clicking on this image, it will get you to that brief. And I pulled out just one example of an intervention that could be used. This could be used at the individual level. It could also be used small group. It could also be used large group. And this is the yes-no skills chart. And so it kind of mirrors if you have had any experience with the good behavior game. It's setting up some criteria for, prerequisite learning skills. And depending on your developmental level, these indicators could look different. So for this one, it's keeping eyes on the teacher, following along with a finger if you're in a reading or a small reading group, raising your hand, or volunteering or contributing. And so at different intervals, the teacher can pause and say, let's take a look at how we're doing against these indicators. And if it's the consensus that, yep, the group, the individual, or the class is meeting that, it's a tally mark in the yes. If they're not, it's a tally mark in the no. And so you kind of keep tabs on how they're meeting expectations along that criteria as you go. You set a goal, you meet the goal, you celebrate. If you don't meet the goal, you circle back to that and set a goal for next time. So this is just one example that's pulled out of there, but there's many more things. There's more links. This is also linked to a component of that brief that's available. So if you're questioning, well, things aren't going well, but I'm having a hard time nailing down exactly what is going on, that I might need to hyper focus on. So again, this is linked. So if you want to kind of look at, where will this bring me and how might I get further guidance on pinpointing a target behavior, this is a good spot for you. Also, a tip from the field, or just remembering that academics and behaviors are often connected. So it is important to ask, is the behavior getting in the way of academics, or is it the other way around? A recent assessment that I did had a large behavioral focus on a student who wasn't performing, was resulting in tantruming, sobbing, vocal opposition, and some property destruction. We do the round of assessments, and she's falling on the very low side cognitively, and we were repeatedly asking her to perform in ways that she that were very, very difficult for her. So for that type of behavioral presentation, this is an academic fix, right? We support her through academic accommodations and instruction and the behavior lessons. So thinking about how behavior and academics are correlated and making sure that we're always analyzing that data from academic domains and behavioral domains. I'm going to kind of lead us to wrapping up here with thinking about a problem with precision. And when I think about a problem, defining a problem with precision, I like to do two things with teachers to kind of get at this target. For one, I want to answer the W questions, right? What are you seeing? When are you most likely to see it? Who is doing it? Where is it happening? And why? What's your best guess at why that behavior is happening? And so this provides us with some context. And the reason that's important is when we look at this thermometer here and we see, okay, 103.2 is the temperature, right? Is that something we're concerned about? I'll have you think about that just for a minute. We're concerned about a temperature of 103.2. And the answer probably is, well, it's not great, right? But are we on the way to the hospital? Are we calling an ambulance? Are we waiting and seeing? Are we going to try some ibuprofen or some Tylenol? Like, our response to that is very different depending on how we answer these W questions. So, for example, who? If this is, a little one with ear pain, right? We probably have a good guess here. We could be dealing with an ear infection. And if we've had a visit to the doctor and we've got some antibiotics on hand, we know what to do, and we're probably not alarmed. We have supports and interventions at hand, at the ready, and we know how to implement that. So we might not be panicking. If, however, this is a bit back to a young person, a little one with a fever, and we provided Tylenol or ibuprofen, and it's been over an hour, and the temperature is going up, we may be more concerned, right? So the what is going on, the when we take the temperature matters, the who it is. Does it matter if it's a 6-month-old versus a 40-year-old versus an 85-year-old? Um, and then why? If we have no idea where the infection is, or where the rationale for the reason for the high number, it could be alarming. So there is a lot of information when behaviors are described to me that I'm still looking for. So when I hear some things like, well, the student is hitting, I pause, not because I'm not worried, but because I need a lot more information. So thinking about taking the behavior of concern and trying to define that with precision is going to be really helpful for moving forward. Now, you might be asking, why is there an alien on the screen? And the alien is my other sort of test of utility here, where when I get to a point where I've defined a behavior, I want it to pass through this alien filter. I want to define it so well that if an alien beamed into the classroom and I gave them my definition of the behavior, that they would be able to observe and then indicate if that behavior happened or didn't happen. And so in that way, it's kind of holding us to making sure our behavior definitions are operational, that they're observable, and that they're measurable. Once we have a behavior that we want to target, and we've done that target behavior with some precision, this tends to be a framework I use most of the time. So when I'm thinking in my mind, I am thinking about, okay, how can we, what things can we do in terms of intervention and supports that will prevent this behavior from happening in the first place, right? What things can we do to avoid it altogether? And are there things, supports, environmental modifications, pre-corrections? Are there things that we can do that help avoid it altogether? Sometimes we need to teach replacement skills. Student has a really maladaptive but efficient way of getting their needs met. And so we need to teach them to do something else. And so is there anything we need to teach them explicitly to support a more adaptive or pro-social way of moving ahead? When we establish those goals for new behaviors, what are we going to do if the student demonstrates that target? So how will we acknowledge or reinforce their movement or their approximation towards a goal? If they continue to make errors, how will we correct that? And are there safety concerns that we should have some protocols or some be prepared for addressing? Now, for remote instruction, I took the liberty of just plugging in a behavior here. Now, this one is the label of a behavior. It's not defined, but it is called dwindling remote attendance, right? They were attending and their attendance is beginning to dwindle. So we could go ahead if we had the time and operationalize the word dwindling, but we're just going to say attendance is falling off. So I plugged in some strategies here. This is not exhaustive. This is just to give you some examples. For prevention, we might want to ensure that we're making positive connections, and that if we're not seeing them, that we're taking some strides to see them. That we're maybe scheduling a weekly check-in with family members or with the student on a more one-to-one or small group basis. We might encourage a daily check-in or an exit slip as a universal practice so that students can have an opportunity to tell us even privately what was difficult about today, what's going well, what did you enjoy about today, ideas for next time, right? Just get their kind of feedback and opportunity for them to share so that if something is bothering them, they're not holding it in. And then create social opportunities, knowing that those are missing right now for a lot of students. In terms of teaching, dwindling remote attendance rate, they might feel like they're getting behind. I know that's something that's going on for a lot of students right now. They're getting behind and overwhelmed, and the anxiety of that is creating more avoidance behaviors instead of more engagement. So how do we teach students to ask for help and normalize that? How do we help them to connect socially while learning remotely? And then remember that we may need to teach the new platform and how to navigate different learning sites. And we might have to get our parents in there too. So how are we supporting families' acquisition of all of these new tools? Oops. For reinforcement, if the student is making some strides, we might want to send an email or to have formalize something with, look, your attendance, if we get 4 days checked off, then you don't have to do work on the 5th day. Some type of acknowledgement that they're making an effort. And so there might be an aversive that can get taken away. And then what are we going to do to correct behavior? We want to provide feedback, right? So check in if a student has missed classes. Take a moment to shoot an email off to family saying, I missed your, son or daughter today. Just checking in. Here's, where they can find some missing work. And then if there's any safety protocols. And I am getting questions around safety, not so much in you know the more traditional things I would hear about in school in terms of aggression, but real worry about students falling off the radar and I'm not seeing them. Are they eating? Are they okay? Like, has anybody heard from them? So just general welfare. And so you'd want to just check in if that seems to be an issue that you're struggling with right now. And then I just wanted to see if we had, and we don't, I was going to leave a few minutes here for questions. I'm not going to go anywhere until everybody else jumps off. So if someone does have questions, I would be happy to take a moment to answer those.